My name is Stephanie Benoit-Kurtz, and with me today I have Mark Sanders from Venafi, and we're going to talk a little bit about exactly what machine identity is, how to protect your machine identities, and a small conversation around the failure to do so, creating resume writing events. Mark, welcome to the conversation here. As we talk about machine identities, can you talk a little bit about exactly what a machine identity is and maybe provide everybody some details around the management of these identities?
People struggle with what are machine identities. If we break it down to the most fundamental level, humans use username and passwords. Well, what do machines use? Well, you can argue that there's quite a bit of things that they use, but one thing that's sort of common across the different types of machines, whether that's a physical machine, a virtual machine, a piece of software running on a machine, or a piece of software that a human's using, it's digital certificate to digital keys. And so we sort of look at that classification as in the world, we've got username and passwords, and we have machine identities, which encompass those certificates and those keys. If we sort of look at the old ways, then that was you put a certificate on a web server and you didn't have to think about it again for 3 to 5 years. Well, that's all changed because of the proliferation of all of these machine identities everywhere. So how are they used? They're still used in every bit of our daily lives of when I go to site A and buy something, when I download something, but they're also used in so many other things in the cars that we drive, into our recreation, into everything we do. Digital identities or machine identities are baked into everything that we do all day long.
You make a great point about that because they're part of securing transactions and part of securing servers and but even to cars or IoT devices or other devices that connect to the network, these identities then become very important. Then are they not?
They are very important. And one of the things that's important about those is it is a security asset, and we need to start thinking about that. And if you're not looking at those as a security asset, then you don't put proper controls. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But you've got to be able to put controls and governance and visibility. You've got to have observancy. All of those things wrapped around these security resources.
Well, and you make a great point about them being assets. We need to understand where they live, how they're configured, how we manage them over time. I mean, I can't count how many times I've talked to customers or even in environments that I've managed where we experienced outages because nobody understood exactly where all of the certificates, for example, lived and what was going on with them. But how do these certificates and how do these identities actually contribute to machine security? How does that work?
One of the interesting conversations I sometimes have with organizations is, we just don't want to really deal with these things. We'll get rid of them. Just stop using them. They're hard to manage. We like to do encryption. We like to do authentication. We like to do these things that are necessary on the modern web. Okay, well, so these things are a required capability. We have to have these things in our lives. And so how do they contribute? They contribute because, as you stated earlier, they provide authentication and they provide encryption. They let us know who I'm talking to, has that message been tampered with while it's in transit, and is it encrypted between you and I? And so it's still the fundamental things of how they work is still fundamental. What's changed is where and the depth and complexity of where they're used.
When we talk about the complexity, though, organizations often really struggle with managing these from understanding where certificates and keys live to how to make sure that they stay current, that they're not expired, to understanding exactly how to maybe provide simple things like even self-service to development teams and those kinds of things. So, why is this environment just so hard to manage?
I've seen this time and time and time and time again, is that an organization has an outage in one particular application team or in one particular segment of their infrastructure, load balancers, for example. And so the load balancer team had an outage. And so Management gets involved and says, how did this outage happen? A certificate expired. Okay, load balancer team, never let that happen again. That is not an official identity management program. That's not going to solve the problem.
A lot of organizations that I've worked with have tracked their keys and their certificates maybe on a spreadsheet or maybe on a couple of spreadsheets. And there's a variety of administrators, and then people turn over. And without that lack of an official identity management program, then there's ways where things just get missed, and as a result, there are outages that are associated to that. When we talk about that ownership piece, how important is that for there to be an ownership model associated to an identity management program?
Yeah, this one is interesting as well. It used to be that whoever the requester was of that certificate or of that key, that was the owner. Well, that sort of got twisted a little bit because, well, what if one person requested it, but then they don't own it for the life cycle, and some other person owns it? Okay, well, maybe that's the right model. But then what happened is we found that there's no boilerplate template as to what is the right ownership model for every single organization, because some organizations are really heavily influenced, or they're doing things by CMDB. So does that mean CMDB always establishes ownership? Well, in some organizations, yes, but in other organizations, no. So this one's not such an easy answer, but every organization must find what works for them and apply that in that official identity management program.
As we look at these programs, the other place where organizations really seem to struggle is the lack of the understanding of the tools that are available out there to help them manage these programs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Whatever the management tool is for that particular person is what they need to use. If they're managing load balancers again, use the tools for that particular load balancer for the specific purpose, right? And then it's a hierarchical relationship. You want to have that platform, that management program that provides the governance, observability, consistency, control across all of the different management tools. So if you're using Istio, Kubernetes, Docker, whatever you're using, use the proper tools that are in place for that particular resource, but still rely on an upper level system that can make your job easier. I often make the joke that we want to use the proper tools, right? What you don't want to do, don't be that person that's out on an island by yourself and struggling. You think you're doing the right thing, but when you're on that island by yourself, you're on the island by yourself, and that's not where you want to be.
Well, and the interesting thing about the tools as well is that they really do provide a more organized way, not only to store the information about machine identities, but then to be able to manage them in a true life cycle approach, which allows a reduction of complexity and helps the different groups that are associated to managing the equipment that those identities are attached to in a more organized fashion.
Yep, exactly.
When organizations fail to consolidate their efforts, what goes wrong there? What happens?
Yeah, this is the one where the person's out on the island by themselves because they were managing things. They thought they were managing their resources effectively, and either they did not have visibility to northbound systems, or northbound systems didn't have visibility into their southbound systems. And so, what you need to make sure of is that we have consolidation, and I keep using the same words over and over, the consistency controls, because that way we're making sure that if there is a problem, we know about it before it becomes a problem. Your title of resume writing events, that's exactly what I've seen. Is some things are as simple as an outage. And outages are not simple, but what's really bad is when all of a sudden we've got keys that were exposed, and how do you answer those questions? And so outage is bad. That's real bad. But it's not as bad as, hey, why were no one looking at these security keys? And can you explain what these keys are used for? That's a tough answer.
Yeah, and then the other challenge is just the associated security flaws that then become apparent above and beyond just outages and P1s or priority one types of escalations where equipment goes down, services stop because they're no longer secured. But even in a situation where maybe the service doesn't stop or the equipment doesn't go down, but the certificate is now expired, and then the challenges associated with that is now you have unsecured transactions occurring. And so all of
Exactly.
those can be really bad situations. Let's talk about these challenges though, because we talk about being on the island, for example, but these challenges that are associated to things like outages, I mean, how bad can it be?
The operational and tactical side, those are the things that are visible. And that's what, as a PKI admin or security operations person, that's what management thinks I do all day, every day, is I'm just running around, tracking ownership, doing firefighting, and just keeping the lights on. That's what it looks like because that's we're stopping outages and making sure that we can stop those things. But we got to make sure that we're doing more than just looking at just purely being operational and updating spreadsheets.
Well, and again, with that tracking of ownership, and trying to reduce that firefighting mentality is such a big piece of that. As we talk about escalated issues, these things are very hidden sometimes until
Yep.
something really bad happens. So, upper level management, board of directors, CIOs, CISOs might not even know that this is occurring until something bad happens. Let's talk about what those bad things are. What about stolen keys? How do keys get stolen? And why is that bad?
If it's a stolen key, then someone has access to my data. They can eavesdrop, they can change data, they can impersonate me, they can do all sorts of bad things. And that's one of the interesting parts about the world that we live in, specifically, the PKI world, machine identity world, is we really don't see things happen bad until it's too late. In the machine identity world, we don't have a firewall that we install and then let it run for a day and then look at the logs and go, hey, look at all this great stuff it did. It doesn't work that way. PKI is like electricity. It's running. It's running, it's running, it's running, it's running. And when it stops working, everyone freaks out. So stolen keys, misplaced keys, those are big, big issues. And when something like that happens, your corporate data has been exposed and your boss's boss is now in the Wall Street Journal.
When we talk about this hidden piece of key management and the discovery of it afterwards, um, is it usually after a breach that organizations find out that their keys have been misplaced or stolen, or that the bad actors have somehow acquired the keys?
It happens so many times. It's one of the funny things about people looking at this as insurance. Even if you don't want to call out an organization, there are many standards bodies that have great recommended practices. All of them say that if an employee leaves an organization, you should rotate the keys that he or her had access to. And I wonder how many people would actually say, yes, I remember when my last coworker left, did we actually rotate the keys that he or she had access to? I'll bet you not one of us can raise our hand and say, absolutely, we do that 100% of the time.
That's a great point, because just that one alone can create some very interesting kind of insider outsider threat types of situations that can become a resume writing event. So let's talk a little bit about some of the recommendations. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of the challenges, but how can organizations simplify their struggles with machine identity management?
That's a great question. And one of the things that we've done over the years is that we've created a practice that we know is successful. And it's that crawl, walk, run sort of approach. It doesn't have to be hard. You start easy and you advance as you do things more mature. You get processes, you get corporate wide buy-in. We call it the proven path, and it works. It doesn't have to be hard. The biggest thing, in my opinion, is you want to have corporate adoption. And those words are easy to say, but what I mean by that is I make some of my team successful, and success spawns success. So when one team's successful, then they'll talk about it to other teams, and it just starts to move on from there.
Well, and I think you make a great point about educating the entire organization about this issue. The education piece is so critical so that different departments, different managers, different executives understand not only why is it complex, but why it's important. When we
Exactly.
look at establishing a formal program, what does a formal program look like? And how can Benify help organizations establish those formal programs?
What we want to do is make sure that we have a formal program that all teams can subscribe to and make sure that everyone is, walking to the same drumbeat. All teams act and work a little bit different, but we should also be following, the same sort of controlled marching in the same direction, I guess.
The challenge around the lack of that formal program is really that there is no one owner. We talked about that path or that lineage of being able to understand exactly what you've got and how you're managing it. The other thing was is we really weren't enabling the developers or the security teams or the different application owners the ability to manage their environments from top to bottom and be responsible for self-service, if you will, or being able to
Right.
take care of their environment. And I think that that joint ownership model is super important because if you're responsible for that application or for that server or for that load balancer or any of those assets, you should own the pieces that help secure that environment as well. And so being able to have that mutually shared responsibility across the enterprise and being able to do things like self-service to get certificates and be able to manage them and be notified when they're expiring, just super important as part of that program. We talk about educating executive teams. For those executives that are watching today, what would you share with them is the most important thing that they could take away from this presentation?
There's two parts on this one. Is make sure that you're communicating to whoever management is for you. Always be educating so that you're not starting from scratch when you have to describe what we're doing and how does this work and why are we doing this. And because if you start on day one and you're always educating, then it's not something that it's all a waterfall. I got to learn describe everything that's going on. I'll talk to some organizations and a manager will say, "Well, I don't understand this DLS stuff. These certificates, they're not very expensive if we buy them from a certificate authority. Educate me on how this stuff works." Well, we've got Ping, we've got Okta, we've got AD, we've got all these things that help manage user identities. A machine identity is the same thing. You don't pay for passwords, but you still have to manage them properly. Get out of the mentality of I'm managing a resource that has a dollar value associated to it. You're managing a security asset.
They should be treated similar to the care and feeding that we do for other types of security assets. When we look at things like enabling self-service, and I alluded to this earlier in my journey, that self-service was a key piece of putting together a program. What have you seen with customers that have implemented self-service?
This is critical to success because if we don't enable a self-service that enables all of our end users with the appropriate toolings and mechanisms that they need to successfully do their job, they have every right to push back and say, I don't want to follow this formal program that you've identified in step 2 of this recommendation. I need to be able to talk to developers, app owners, security ops teams, infrastructure teams, networking team, database teams, all of these teams, and enable them to use the toolings that help them do their day-to-day jobs. And again, if you don't do that, then they have every right to push back.
Well, and the other challenge around that too is that you end up with what I call certificates or key sprawl, where
Yes.
if they're not enabled to be able to do self-service, if you will, then they go self-service through a company credit card and another certificate authority, or they self-service through some other way to get keys. And then what you have is that visibility issue along with then the sprawl around the issuing certificate authorities, for example. How about turning on validation? Why is that important? Why should anybody care about that?
Validation years and years ago, it had a great value, but there were some technical challenges with it. Those challenges are gone. So turn on validation. Let validation help you. Let it figure out what's working, what's not on the network, what is on the network, where are the historical certificates. It works and it will save you a lot of time.
By turning on validation, you're creating that secondary level of checks to make sure that things are working correctly. Because every once in a while, you apply a certificate, for example, and maybe it doesn't get applied correctly. maybe there's some kind of challenge with it. And so to me, validation is kind of one of those ways to help you understand, is it really doing what it's supposed to be?
Right.
And then what about creating a resistance strategy? Talk a little bit about that and why that would be important for the folks that are listening today.
On this one, um, we sort of tie this one back to the self-service, because if you have someone, or not usually it's not someone, it's a group of people that have some resistance to the formal program we're trying to put in place. Let's not discount what they're saying. Listen to what they're saying. They may have, very, very valid reasons. Most of the time what I hear is they have valid reasons for this resistance, but it's historical. It's they tried something that didn't work, and now that's their line in the sand. Let's listen to what they say. Let's show them that there is a better way, because it's hard. We don't like change. And if I've got my way of doing something and you're telling me there's a better way, I don't know that I really want to take the time and effort to learn it. But if someone shows me that and I see, oh, it really will save me a lot of time, then that's a good strategy to bring down my resistance and let me see if that would really work for me.
Absolutely. And so as we look at just kind of our parting thoughts with folks, and we look at the different elements that we really can provide as kind of that last conversation here. We look at addressing resistance. We look at understanding environments, and being able to have visibility is critical to success. And then the formalized policy. And so, Mark, if you could talk just a little bit in review of how important programs are and how formalized policies maybe reduce security risks and outages.
Yes. Um, let policy assist you in your day-to-day, lives. Put policies in place and say, these are our policies. We must adhere to these. Self-service goes right hand in hand with policy. You need to follow. One particular client of mine does a great job. Here are our self-service options. If you can't use one of these, you're outside the policy. Let us know why you can't. And then they'll either change the policy, or someone needs to go back to those policies. But let policies help you. They're not there to hurt.
Absolutely. And the best way really is to have an effective management strategy to manage your machine identities. It creates a better layered defense strategy. It improves security. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. These best practices are out there today. Venafi provides a great environment to be able to not only provide a platform that provides visibility, but management of your machine identities, and to prevent a resume writing event. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Stephanie.